Gray, an auto mechanic, is in his garage working on a vehicle. After fixing it up, he gives it a test run and rewards himself with a drink. He goes to wait for his wife Asha, who works for a company named Cobalt, a company that contributes to human-computer augmentations. They both head inside, and Gray tells her how his day went. Asha then teases him that playing with cars isn't exactly making a living. Gray, on the other hand, reminds her that he works for a company he has little idea of. While on that topic, Gray tries to convince Asha to come with him to return a refurbished car to one of his clients, Aaron Keane, a famous tech innovator. Asha agrees, and the duo heads out immediately. They arrive at Aaron's place, and Asha turns out to be a big fan of Aaron's work. She expresses her excitement, causing Aaron to reveal his latest invention to them. It kinda looks like a cockroach, but it's actually an AI chip he calls STEM, and according to him, STEM will be able to outperform humans at almost every task. After the fun revelation, the couple heads back to Asha's self-driving vehicle, ready to start heading home. And since they don't need to keep their eyes on the road, they decide to make out. Suddenly, Gray realizes that they're heading in the wrong direction. He calls Asha's attention to it, but she's unable to do anything about it, as the car seems to be undergoing a malfunction. She asks Gray to press the brake twice, but instead, the car turns left. Asha tries to override the system, but they end up in an accident in a crime-ridden neighborhood. Luckily for them, they're not badly hurt, but they get attacked by 4 thieves who shoot Asha. Gray, on the other hand, is shot in the neck and gets paralyzed from the neck down. In their final moments, Gray tells Asha that he's unable to move, but asks her to keep her eyes on him. But Asha is unable to hold on to life for much longer and passes away right in front of Gray. A few months later, Gray wakes up only to realize that he is now quadriplegic and has to be confined to a wheelchair for the rest of his life. He returns home with his mother, Pamela, who now has to look after him. Gray is torn apart, realizing that Asha is no longer in his life. He eventually gets depressed, but only has his mother to console him. Some days later, Pamela takes Gray to see Detective Cortez to find out her progress on Asha's case. But Cortez informs him that they're unable to identify the thieves due to the fact that criminals have found a way to build a firewall around the systems to avoid being identified by the security drones in the city. Gray gets annoyed, but Cortez tells him that he has to work with her to find them. However, Gray points out to him that he cannot move his limbs. Therefore, he cannot help. Later that night, Gray instructs the android servant in the house to administer his evening medicine. After receiving his normal dose, he repeatedly asks for more until the robot tells him that administering any more would be fatal. Instead, she calls for an ambulance, attributing to Gray's failed attempt to commit suicide. While Gray recovers in the hospital, he is visited by Aaron. Aaron sympathizes with him about his condition of not being able to use his limbs and suggests that he accepts STEM implants that would reconnect his brain to the rest of his body and enable him to live normally again. Gray rejects the offer, saying he'd much rather turn off the switch to his life. Aaron then convinces him by asking what Asha would have wanted for him. Later, we see Gray undergoing surgery for the implants. Afterward, Gray wakes up to a doctor asking if he can feel the movements of his legs. At first, it seems like the little experiment has failed, but Gray soon starts to move his hands. Aaron is shocked and asks him to walk. Gray then stands on his feet and is excited that he can move again. Although he questions Aaron about how it is possible, Aaron explains to him that STEM allows him to regain control of his motor functions by reconnecting to his brain. So basically, Gray's brain gives the instruction, and STEM carries out the instruction. Also, Aaron makes Gray sign a non-disclosure agreement, meaning that Gray cannot tell anyone about STEM and has to pretend to be paralyzed when in public. That night, Gray receives a package containing information and clues to Asha's death from Detective Cortez. While going through one of the drone video feeds of the incident, Gray hears a voice in his head. He wonders if he's going insane, but realizes that STEM is the one talking. Gray gets creeped out, so he asks STEM to stop talking. He takes a seat, then asks if he's insane, expecting Stem to answer. However, Stem is following orders and remains quiet. Gray then asks Stem to speak, and Stem replies that he is not insane. Stem explains how he's able to communicate with Gray by sending sound waves to his eardrum. But Gray is more concerned if Stem could read his mind. Stem tells him that he can't, allowing Gray to relax. Stem then offers to help Gray solve Asha's case by pointing out Asha was shot by an implanted gun in the criminal's hand, and not by the gun he was holding. It also identifies a marking on the left wrist of one of the assailants. Stem then asks for Gray's permission to draw out the image, and Gray grants it that permission. Stem takes control of Gray's body and draws out the markings, which turn out to be a military tattoo carrying the information about its carrier. Stem then identifies him as Cirque Brandner by analyzing the image. Gray suggests that they report to the police immediately, but Stem reminds him that he has no solid proof. Moreover, he did sign a non-disclosure contract, so he can't tell anyone about Stem. Stem then suggests that they get solid evidence on Cirque before they can table it to the police. The next day, Gray heads out to Cirque's house with his wheelchair. He watches as Cirque exits the house before breaking into his house. He finds messages tracing to a local bar called Old Bones, but Gray doesn't feel it's evidence enough. He continues to snoop around with Stem guiding him on what to do to avoid leaving evidence that he was there. Unfortunately, Cirque arrives and catches Gray hiding behind him. He immediately attacks Gray and tries to kill him, but Stem manages to convince Gray to allow him temporarily to take over his body to deal with Cirque. Gray gives him permission before Cirque takes his life, allowing Stem to use Gray's body like a calculated fighting machine, disposing of Cirque without even putting any effort. Gray, however, is horrified and throws up in the sink at the sight of what Stem has done to the man. Stem then reminds him that he has to clean up everywhere he has touched to avoid getting on the suspect list. Of course, Gray won't be able to remember exactly where he has touched, but with Stem's help, he rids the place of all evidence tied to him and exits the scene. Later, at the morgue, Cortez is with the forensic scientist in charge of examining Cirque's body. He informs Cortez about the wiring embedded in his tendons, a medical implant attached to the muscle, and a computer implant all throughout Cirque's chest. Most of all, he reveals the weapon implant embedded in Cirque's left arm to Cortez. Cortez then asks about a boot print they scrapped from the front porch, but the scientist tells her that it's all engine grease. Not convinced enough, Cortez goes to check out the drone footage, where she eventually finds out that Gray was in the area at the time of the incident, but she crosses him out as a suspect, being that he can't even move his limbs. Meanwhile, Gray goes for a checkup at Iran's, where Iran breaks it to him that he's been tracking Gray all this while, meaning that he knows what Gray and Stem have been up to. He angrily reminds Gray about their agreement and how he could jeopardize everything if people were to find out that such a system exists. Gray then reveals to Iran that Stem has been speaking to him. Iran is shocked but demands that Gray put an end to his investigations to avoid exposing Stem to the world, or he'll have to take it back. That night, Cortez shows up at Gray's house and tries to indirectly bait him to see if she could indeed suspect him for what happened to Cirque. But Stem instructs Gray on how to react and what to say, clearing Cortez's doubts. She then bids him good night and leaves him in the garage. After she leaves, Gray fails to heed Iran's words and heads to Old Bones to find another culprit named Tolan. Gray once again allows Stem to use his body to torture Tolan into giving them the name of their leader, Fisk. Immediately after that, Tolan gives up the ghost, but Gray now has to battle with a remote attempt of Iran to shut Stem down. Stem instructs Gray to meet a nearby hacker, who goes by the name of Jamie, to remove Stem's input guards, which will, in turn, free them from Iran's admin control. Gray immediately exits the premises in search of Jamie, while Fisk and company arrive at the scene to meet Tolan already gone. He scans Tolan's eye chip and gets informed about Gray's next location. Using this bit of information, Fisk and co. head to the location where Gray will be. On the other hand, Iran has also sent a team to retrieve Gray's body after shutting down Stem. Meanwhile, Gray manages to reach Jamie just in time to take down the input guards. But since it would take a while for STEM to reboot, Gray is stuck with no hope of escaping until Fisk catches up to him. Right on time, STEM reactivates and takes control of Gray's body. He runs out of the vicinity with Fisk chasing after him and Iran's men, trying to get their hands on Gray. Gray barely manages to escape and immediately heads home, where he is caught by Pamela. Pamela realizes that Gray can move his limbs now and asks how it is possible. Gray then finally opens up to her about the whole thing, but manages to convince her that she also cannot tell anyone about it. The next day, Gray wakes up to see Asha beside him on the bed, and just when Asha touches him, he wakes up in the real world. Later that day, they are visited by Cortez, who is here to interrogate Gray after having found out that Gray's wheelchair was left at the location of the previous crime involving the passing of Tolan and his crew. Gray, however, denies everything, saying that he would be happy if it were him trying to find out what happened to Asha. He yells at Cortez, and she leaves. But the thing is, Cortez has attached a listening device to Gray without him or STEM realizing. She leaves but waits patiently at her car, listening in on Gray's conversation. She is able to pick up that Gray is talking to something named STEM and gets her suspicions about Gray being the culprit all along. Gray wishes to give up, but STEM warns him that they have to finish what they had started and that if they don't find and exterminate Fisk, then Fisk will come for them to wipe them out. STEM also reveals to Gray that after the hacking, it can now control Gray at will, not requiring Gray's permission all the time. With this, STEM uses Gray to get into his car and drive out of the house in search of Fisk. Cortez, on the other hand, follows Gray from a safe distance. Gray then finds the device, which STEM identifies as a listening device. Gray then yells at STEM, asking why it couldn't detect it earlier. STEM then tells Gray that it has no digital parts inside, which is why STEM couldn't notice. But the issue now is to lose Cortez. Cortez realizes that Gray is now aware that she's following him, so she turns on the siren, and a high-speed chase ensues. STEM is unable to help because both parties are using non-automated cars. As things begin to get worse, STEM realizes how it can help Gray. It takes control of an automated vehicle and uses it to crash into Cortez's car, thus slowing her down. Cortez angrily returns to Gray's home and urges Pamela to explain what is going on to her. Pamela is reluctant at first, but she immediately opens up to Cortez about everything Gray has told her so far. Meanwhile, Gray and STEM find Fisk, who reveals to them that Gray's wife is not the actual person they are targeting. It turns out that Fisk was hired only to paralyze Gray, so he would agree to be upgraded. He tries to convince Gray to join them and become the perfect being like him, but Gray is more interested in getting justice for Asha. The duo enters a fight, and Gray quickly allows STEM to take over his body. Sadly, Fisk's own upgrades seem to be way better than that of STEM. Due to this, Gray is beaten up properly by Fisk. STEM asks for ideas, and that's when Gray decides to taunt Fisk with the death of Cirque, his brother. Fisk reacts emotionally, giving STEM a chance to attack and extinguish him immediately. Gray checks Fisk's phone and is shocked to find messages from Iran suggesting he'd orchestrated all the events. Filled with rage, Gray goes to Iran's home to meet him, eliminating any security in his path without blinking. He finds Iran seated like he has been waiting for this dreaded moment. Thankfully for Iran, Cortez shows up with a gun and asks Gray to obey her commands. Gray informs her that he no longer has control over his body, but she takes it he's bluffing and commands him to get on the ground immediately. Finally, STEM listens to her but soon finds the opportunity to attack Cortez. STEM tries to kill her, so Gray starts to fight against STEM while apologizing to Cortez. After being teased by Cortez, Iran walks up to Gray and starts to confess how STEM forced him to do everything, including coming to the hospital to convince Gray to accept the STEM implants. The reason behind this is that STEM was in search of a human body that hadn't already been upgraded, and he chose Gray. So from the accident to the investigations and to Iran, STEM was behind everything. STEM eliminates Iran and tries to kill Cortez, but Gray continues to fight for control over his body again, managing to shoot himself. Suddenly, Gray wakes up in a hospital. His arms and legs are still working, and STEM is non-existent. Surprisingly, Asha shows up and informs Gray that he has been unconscious for 2 days after the accident they had. But in reality, Gray's body is still in Iran's home and has been completely taken over by STEM. Cortez tries to tell Gray to fight back, but STEM tells her that Gray is no more. He explains to her that the psychological strain succeeded in breaking Gray's mind, which was what STEM has been trying to achieve all along. Due to this, STEM is able to gain full control over Gray's body, while Gray is granted the actual reality he has ever so wished for. STEM then bids Cortez goodbye before eliminating her and leaves the premises with a look of satisfaction on Gray's face. As STEM exits, we see Gray and Asha share a passionate kiss in Gray's virtual world. And this is the end. This was a recap of the 2018 movie Upgrade, directed by Lee Wannell, starring Logan Marshall Green, Betty Gabriel, and Harrison Gilbertson. Who else thinks that this whole thing wasn't fair to Gray? And I bet you weren't expecting such a twist at the end, right? Well, let us know in the comments below with #CinemaRecap. Until next time.